Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We are waiting for another one of our panel respondents to show up, but want to be mindful of everybody's time tonight. My name is Matt McComas. I'm the Associate Director of 21st Century Cities Initiative. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're real lucky to have Brad Humphreys, Professor in Economics at West Virginia University, with us here at Hopkins this week. He's actually a graduate of Hopkins, so he knows the city well, and it's good to have him coming back. And tonight he's going to give a talk titled Caught Stealing, the Pros and Cons of Subsidies for Professional Sports Facilities and Their Impact on Cities. And our agenda is going to be, Brad's going to give a talk, an overview, and then we're going to have responses from hopefully two local public officials, but okay, he's on his way. Great. So we're lucky to have Delegate Tony Bridges with us tonight, who represents Maryland's 41st District, and Councilman Bill Henry, who will be here shortly, who represents Baltimore City's 4th District. And with that, I'll hand it off to Brad, and then we'll open it up to the crowd for Q&A at the end. So, thanks. Thanks, man.
Well, I do want to start off by thanking the 21st Century Cities Initiative for inviting me down here, giving me the opportunity to be back on the Hopkins campus again, and to spend some time in Baltimore. Not only am I a Hopkins alum, but I lived in Baltimore for 17 years. So I'm pretty familiar with the area. I've lived in many places around the city. I've spent a substantial amount of time and energy over the last 20 years doing research on the economic impact and financing of professional sports facilities. And so the point I want you to take away from my background picture here is this is not the caught stealing I'm talking about. It's actually this kind of caught stealing that I'm going to be referring to over the course of my talk. As we explore the subsidies, that are provided to the owners of professional sports teams for the construction and ongoing operation often of those facilities. So I'll just start off by first, in the outline of my talk, documenting the subsidization that goes on, and then I'll go through some of the rationales for why we might subsidize construction of professional sports facilities and why we might not. I'll talk about how we can think about the amount of subsidy that's provided to a professional sports team owner as the result of a negotiation between the city government or local decision makers and team owners. And I'll also document how the evidence is that local governments tend to lose in these negotiations, and that they wind up paying a higher fraction of construction costs than they might otherwise. And then I'll close. I obviously would be remiss if I didn't address the Pimlico issue, and I'll close with a few remarks about that, although those are going to be more speculative than evidence-based, because economists know very little about the economic impact of horse racetracks on the local economy. Okay, so we provide, as a society in the United States, substantial subsidies for the construction of professional sports facilities. Of course, here in Baltimore, the classic example is Oriole Park and Camden Yards, which, if we looked at the subsidy provided there in 2017 dollars, would be just about a little under $300 million. 95% of the cost of Camden Yards was subsidized by public funds. Or another example that people here should be quite familiar with, and if you're a baseball fan, it's been on television pretty frequently in the last week, is Nationals Park in Washington, D.C. That got a $616 million subsidy. And it's the rationale for these subsidies, or why we maybe shouldn't provide as much of that money as we do, is going to be the primary focus of my presentation. But I also want to point out that myself and other economists who do research on this topic, we realize that sports has a very important part in the fabric of urban communities. And they provide us with opportunities to experience many things that we wouldn't be able to experience otherwise. And I know this for a fact because, I was there when Cal broke the record at that game. So I know what that does. And I'm going to focus on the economics because I'm trained as an economist and this is how I think about the world. But I do want to point out that, everybody, I've strenuously argued against these subsidies for most of my professional career. But I still do recognize that there are transcendent moments that are generated by the presence of a professional sports team in the city that are probably impossible to put a dollar value on, no matter what economists may think. So I want to try to give a balanced picture before I move on. So, documenting how much we in the United States subsidize the construction of professional sports facilities. There's a lot of information in this graph, so let me walk through it a little bit. This tells us the size of the subsidy that was provided for every new professional sports stadium or arena. That would be NHL, NBA, MLB, NFL, from 1970 until about 2012. An S is a stadium construction project, and an A is an arena construction project. And on the vertical axis, we have just in millions of dollars, millions of 2017 dollars, the size of the subsidy that was provided for every one of these. The pink line running through there is the average subsidy in the sample that was provided, just a little bit over $200 million on average throughout this period. And so there's a couple of things that you can take away from this and you should observe from this picture. First, if we look at the 70s and 80s, in inflation-adjusted terms, those subsidies were not that large. Most of those subsidies in the 70s and 80s are below that average line. So they're below average levels of subsidization during that period. And there's also not that many new stadiums and arenas built over that period. Right, it really thins out, especially here in the 80s and late 70s. But these are all relatively low subsidies, except for we've got one outlier here. And then the other thing is, anything that's in gold, those facilities have already been replaced by a new facility. So there's an outlier here, a stadium which was built in the mid-1970s with a huge subsidy, $600 million in 2017 dollars of subsidy, and is still in use. Does anybody know what that facility? Have a guess at what that facility is? It's the Louisiana Superdome. Still in use. Although the Saints have been making a lot of noise lately about that needing to be replaced. It's obviously pretty old. And the next thing you can see is that starting in the early 1990s, a lot of people anecdotally timed this to the opening of Camden Yards, which was sort of revolutionized at least baseball park design. But you can see that there's a whole lot more of these S's and A's here in the 1990s and 2000s than there was back here. We've had a stadium construction boom and arena construction boom since 1990 in the United States. And the third thing you can see is that a lot of the observations that are above average are out here in the right part of this graph recently. So the total amount of subsidies per stadium or arena construction project awarded has increased substantially over time. And you can see there's actually almost no below average subsidies provided after about 2005. So that's a lot of money, a lot of stadiums all over the country, and arenas all over the country, and it looks like we're subsidizing more and more and more. So the next interesting thing that I want everybody to understand is stadiums and arenas are lasting less and less in terms of how long they operate before they're deemed by the owner of the team to be obsolete and need to be replaced. So this just again shows every point here, every letter here, S stadium, A arena, is the age at which all the stadiums and arenas that were replaced, how long they've been in operation. Starting in 1970 up until right now, even the ones that are planned to be replaced soon. So, and that red line is just a trend line drawn through the middle of those points. You can see that it is downward sloping. It used to be back in the 70s when stadiums and arenas were replaced, they were replacing stadiums or arenas that have been in use 40 to 60 years. And now we're down to the point where some facilities are being replaced that were in operation and use substantially less than 20 years, or around 20 years. And the average now is down to about 21 years. For example, Turner Field, where the Atlanta Braves played, opened up in 1996 for the Atlanta Olympics. It was replaced in less than 19 years after it opened. The owner of the Braves said, it's no longer viable, we have to have a new stadium. So all of this big boom in stadium and arena construction in the 90s and 2000s, that means in the next 10 to 15 years, many of these facilities are going to be deemed obsolete by the team owners, and they're going to request more subsidies to replace these facilities. So we are looking at, this is not a problem that's going away. We are looking at potentially a lot of additional subsidization, billions of dollars worth of subsidization over the next 10 to 15 years. So this is something we should think about. Finally, again, how are these subsidies determined? Well, think of it as a prolonged period of bargaining between local decision makers and team owners. And this goes on everywhere. I mean, it's going on right now. The Oakland Athletics have been complaining about the facility they play in Oakland Alameda Stadium, and they want that replaced. It's been going on for years. One of my previous jobs was at the University of Alberta, and that's in Edmonton. And while I was there, the owner of the Edmonton Oilers continually said that his facility was the oldest in hockey. It was, except for Madison Square Garden, Rexall Place. And they went on for years and years and years about how much the city was going to contribute, how much the team would contribute. And that's a negotiation, right? So we think about the size of this subsidy as the result of a prolonged negotiation. And this is just the distribution of how much taxpayers provide in terms of the fraction of total costs across all those new facility construction projects I showed you. So in about 10% of the cases, the team pays for all the costs. So it is possible for teams to not need a government subsidy to build a new stadium or arena and operate it. We have an example of that right down the road, the Washington Redskins. The team built, Jack Kent Cook when he owned the Redskins, built that stadium, and it's owned by the Redskins. The San Francisco Giants in San Francisco built their stadium, financed it. It had zero public financing, right? So it is possible. You know, these teams can still remain successful and build their own stadiums, but it doesn't happen very much. Instead, out here, in about 33% of the cases, the local government and the taxpayers wind up paying 100% of the construction costs. So I'll come back to this a little bit later in my talk, but the usual economic model that we use to think about how negotiations turn out is called the Nash bargaining model. And in the Nash bargaining model, the outcome from that, the prediction from that is a 50-50 split. We can see that is absolutely not happening. If this sort of negotiation between teams and local governments was a result of Nash bargaining, then we'd expect to see most of this mass tied up here around 0.5, or maybe 0.4 to 0.6. That's not what we get. It's out here and out here. That means something else is going on in bargaining. I'll get to hold that thought in your mind. I'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so we subsidize the construction of professional sports facilities quite a bit. Why is it? What arguments are made for why we should subsidize that? And the arguments I'm going to go through here are the arguments that are always made in every negotiation between teams and cities. I think that there are some good reasons that we might subsidize the construction of professional sports facilities, but that's not what I'm going to go through, because those arguments that I think are reasonable, nobody ever makes. Instead, there's another set of arguments that I want to go through that would be much more common in terms of what you'd see actually take place. So the rationale number one, and the reason that's trotted out in 100% of these cases for why the government should subsidize the construction of a new professional sports facility is the pro sports teams and the venues they play in are engines of local economic growth. It's going to be great for the local economy if we can do that. And it's going to generate tangible economic benefits. I first got interested in this research topic when Baltimore stole the Cleveland Browns from Cleveland, who became, of course, the Ravens, right? And the Ravens Stadium was, and of course, Baltimore's completely justified. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on Baltimore. We lost the Colts, right? And we all know what a mark that left on this community. When I still remember vividly, they're still showing the clips of those Mayflower vans leaving in the middle of the night with the Colts going to Indianapolis. So I'm not. But we did steal them from Cleveland. But they got a team back, right? It's unfortunate that Cleveland got the Browns name back. We should have cut that deal when the Colts left to keep, then we could still have the Colts if they were here in town. Anyway, when that happened, of course, that stadium where the Ravens play is 100% publicly financed. And as part of that, I read in the paper and heard on the local news at that time the results of an economic impact study that claimed that when the Ravens got to town and the stadium was built, the games being played and the team being in town would generate something like 15 or 20,000 jobs, $300 million worth of new economic activity in the city or in the Baltimore area. And I thought about that, and I'd never seen one of these before, and I thought, that's ridiculous. We're talking about 10 home games a year on Sundays. So how are 70,000 people going into the stadium 8 or 10 times a year, generating 15,000 full-time jobs? It just seems pretty implausible to me. So I'll talk more about those economic impact studies in a minute. But what that led me to do was to say, well, okay, this is not the first time a team has moved from one city to another. Teams are moving all over the place, right? If you go back to the 50s, when the Giants and the Dodgers left New York City, we got that. The Colts left Baltimore in 1984. Lots of teams have moved around all the time. I mean, Washington, D.C. had two different versions of the Washington Senators, right, who both left town. So if the impact of a team moving in to a city is really that big, I should be able to go back and look at economic outcomes in those cities when teams moved into another city and see some huge impact. And I wrote that paper. And what I found was that nothing. There's actually, if we go back and look at what happened before and after all these different sports teams moved into cities, or new expansion teams were awarded the cities, the local economy didn't look like it performed any better after they got there than before. So where's the 15,000 jobs, right? Where's the $300 million? Because believe me, if $300 million worth of new economic activity showed up in a city, if we flew a helicopter over downtown Baltimore and dropped $300 million onto the streets, you'd probably see some additional consumer spending or something like that in the city, right? If you looked at what happened. So that should give us pause when we think about the validity of this claim in economic impact studies that pro sports are engines of economic growth. Other side of the coin, you could also go back and look at all these instances where sports teams left cities. If professional sports is really an engine of local economic growth, you should see cities suffer economically, or at least experience some adverse effects when teams leave. There's no evidence of that. It doesn't look like any city was any worse off after any team left it at any time in the last 60 years in the United States, as far back as we have good data on. So then I had another idea once I got rolling and started working on this research topic. So not only, if you follow sports, not only do we have teams moving, leaving, and arriving, but there's also a lot of strikes and lockouts that have interrupted the play of professional sports over the last 30 years. For example, there's no NHL team in Baltimore, you might not have noticed, but the National Hockey League canceled the entire 2004-2005 season because of labor dispute, right? They just didn't play hockey games for a whole year. Now, if sports are really a driver of local economic activity, you would think that those cities with NHL teams might have suffered during that period, right? Well, they did. And there's not only the NHL lockout, there's other NHL lockouts, there's been NBA strikes. As we all know, if we're baseball fans, in 1994, Major League Baseball got in a dispute with players and canceled basically the entire season from about the 1st of August on, including the playoffs, right? Look at the economic performance in all those cities where that happened. No evidence that there was any adverse economic impact from those strikes and lockouts. If pro sports teams are really engines of local economic growth, you might think that after a new facility opened or a new team came into town, that there would be a lot of new businesses opening up, especially near the facilities. I've written a paper that shows that there's absolutely no evidence of new business formation within 2 or 3 miles of every new sports facility that opened up in the last 15 years in the U.S. So, look, I've been to many. I used to be an Orioles full season ticket holder. I've been to many professional sporting events. I've walked around inside and outside these stadiums on game day, and you can't dispute that there's a lot of economic activity going on there. The bars and restaurants around Camden Yards or the Ravens Stadium are full on game day, and people are spending a lot of money. The parking lots are full. People are paying a lot of money to park in other lots outside, that aren't operated by the team. That's spending, and that's economic activity. How come that's not showing up, or why don't we see that? Well, economists have identified what we call the displacement effect that explains why all that spending is not really new spending. Because the idea here is all that spending on game day or in and around stadiums and arenas, that's just locals and their entertainment spending, and they would have spent that money on some other form of local entertainment somewhere else in the city if those teams weren't there. So, instead of going out to dinner in Towson, you drive down to Camden Yards and get dinner and go to the ballgame. Same amount of money spent, it's just that the stadium or arena concentrates that spending in and around the facilities on game day. So that's called the displacement effect. Because then on net, over the whole economy, there's no change. It's just moving stuff around. That's the displacement effect, and that's consistent with this idea that there's no tangible economic impact generated by benefits generated by professional sports facilities. I think that's what's happened. What happens? There's some certainly emerging evidence that supports that idea. It's hard to empirically test this idea because you've got to have really detailed spending data that is detailed both temporally. You need to know spending on different days and different points in the city, and those data sets are not very easy to come by. But still, there are a few papers that have looked at that, and it looks like that's the pattern that we observe. Okay, well, rationale number 2 that often gets made is that a new stadium or arena will revitalize some part of a city that needs revitalization that's run down, that is only maybe a shadow of its former self. And the whole displacement effect idea suggests that really does happen. I mean, because obviously if you focus a lot of economic activity in one place, that's going to probably make that neighborhood a lot nicer. They're going to have nicer bars and restaurants open up. There might be ancillary development like new residential housing, things like that. So, I think that can, I don't doubt that can happen. But how might we look for evidence that gentrification or revitalization really occurs? Well, one place you might look where it's easy to get data on would be house prices. And if the presence of a stadium or arena and a team playing in there is an amenity, economic theory tells us that any sort of urban amenity, if it exists, will be capitalized into housing prices. So if you really revitalize a neighborhood, then compared to before the stadium was there, housing prices should go up a lot. There's a lot of evidence on that, and it's all mixed. There's really Sometimes people will find, and these are all basically case studies of different cities. We'll find some evidence that housing prices indeed did go up after new stadiums were built, but it's pretty mixed. And in fact, I've recently published a paper that shows that house prices near the NBA teams in Seattle and Charlotte that left actually went up after the teams left. And we explain that result in the paper by the idea that these teams also generate disamenities, traffic, crowds, crime, noise, things like that, which go away when these teams left. So in that sense, we can think about this revitalization might be a two-edged sword. And sure, it might raise property values, or it might concentrate economic activity in one place in the city, but there's downsides to that as well. I'll touch on that a bit in a few minutes. The other thing I want to point out is that neighborhood revitalization, or what we can call it gentrification, has unequal impacts on society. If you're a property owner where that new stadium gets built, you make out, right? Especially if property values really go up as a consequence of gentrification. But if you're a renter and you're not able to, get a job on the roster of one of those teams, you're probably worse off. You're almost certainly worse off because your rent's going up. If gentrification is successful and you're not able to afford the new rent, you've probably got to move out. So that leads to a related point, which is in urban economics, there's this idea that describes the patterns that we might see in both wages and housing prices in a city called the spatial equilibrium idea. So if we look around a city like Baltimore, it's obvious that there are huge disparities, say, in the income or earnings of people that live in different parts of the city. People that live in Homewood or the areas up here around Hopkins, probably the average income there is much higher than people who live in neighborhoods in East Baltimore. But the spatial equilibrium idea is, even though incomes are different, sort of life satisfaction or utility that economists talk about is the same across all areas of a city. And that's because people who live in the high income areas have to pay much higher prices for their homes or higher rents. And people with lower incomes are sort of compensated by also living in areas that have very low cost of living, very low rents, or very low housing prices. So it's an idea. This is built into, this is not my idea. Let me tell you one thing. This is deeply built into the urban economics literature, the idea. And there is evidence that observed patterns in housing prices and incomes are consistent with this idea. I'm just saying it's out there. When I teach urban economics, we have a very lively debate in that class about whether spatial equilibrium really holds in cities. But real urban economists would say as a first approximation it works. Anyway, the point there is, if spatial equilibrium is really describes what we observe in cities, then these place-based policies of trying to revitalize a specific neighborhood, that's called a place-based policy, it's not clear that their social welfare improving if spatial equilibrium holds. Rationale number 3 is that professional sports teams provide important intangible benefits to a city. That they put a city on the map, right? World-class cities have professional sports teams. Professional sports teams provide a sense of community that we wouldn't get from other activities in the community. It provides cities or areas with unique local identities. Think about Green Bay, Wisconsin, right? How would we even ever hear Green Bay, Wisconsin if it weren't for the Packers, right? So, this argument gets made actually more than you would think. I testified before the Washington, D.C. City Council when they were considering that $600 million subsidy for Nationals Park. And I went through my usual shtick about it's probably a bad idea to throw $600 million for a new baseball park. And the president of the DC Council at the time, I can't remember his name, told me that Washington, DC needed a professional baseball team because that would make Washington, DC a world-class city. I'm not making this up, right? To which I told him, well, you know, it's the capital of the free world. And you've already got a professional football team and a professional basketball team and a professional hockey team in town. How much additional world-class city status is a baseball team going to provide but he wouldn't hear anything of it. He was convinced. And of course they went on, nobody ever listens to me, they went on and gave him $600 million. So everybody agrees, and economists agree with this as well, that these things do have value. Providing an important sense of community in your city is a valuable thing. We always give examples like the CEO of a corporation and a janitor are riding down the elevator in the building. What exactly are they going to have to talk about except perhaps the local sports team during their elevator ride? It's probably the truth, right? So, economists, we think we can value just about everything. And economists have devised a method for valuing these sort of intangible benefits. It's called the Contingent valuation method, and it's a survey-based method. It was actually developed not to value the intangible benefits of the Orioles. It was developed to value the intangible benefits or intangible costs that were generated by the Exxon Valdez disaster, where a drunken supertanker captain ran his supertanker into some rocks in Prince William Sound in Alaska and dumped a couple of million gallons of crude oil into the water, into a very pristine, beautiful place. And of course, Exxon got sued and lost the case. And the question became, well, how do we assign damages, dollar value of damages, that we should fine Exxon for this? And this contingent valuation method was actually designed, formalized to answer that question. But it applies to anything that's intangible, right? So, they put a dollar value in the Exxon Valdez case on just all of us in this room. We derive some benefit from knowing there's this pristine natural wild area in Alaska where everything's beautiful. We don't even have to go. We never have to have been there. We get some benefit from just knowing that, right? Put a dollar value on that, they did. That's an intangible. So there have been a number of studies that have tried to value the intangible benefits of professional sports teams in the US, and they come up to be, they're not zero. They have value, and people value them. But the interesting thing about these estimates is they're always a fraction of the actual subsidies that are provided. A typical estimate for the intangible benefits of a team like the Pittsburgh Penguins would be $40 million. Not trivial, but it's not the $600 million that the Nationals got in Washington, D.C., for example. So that's a rationale for subsidization, just not for the size of the subsidies that we typically see. Now, at this point, some of you, even before, might have been thinking, wait a minute, I remember reading an article somewhere, hearing something on the news about these sports teams generate huge economic impact, positive economic impacts in cities. And so doesn't that apply here, wherever I'm thinking about whether I want to support a subsidy for a team or not? I want to now talk about, I mentioned these economic impact studies before, but I just want to get into the weeds a little bit and talk about them. So there are these ex ante, that is their forecasts, economic impact studies. When I first saw the one here in Baltimore, it was, if we get the build a new stadium and get the Ravens, then this will happen. That's forecast, right? That's not some sort of ex post fact-based evidence like my research is undertaken. So these economic impact studies get generated all the time. Every time a team wants a subsidy, one of these goes along with it. And you can pretty easily identify them because they have really high production values, right? They're nice and flashy in color, and they're prepared by consultants, and who have graphic designers and make them look really nice, and not just like the academic papers I write. Like this one's really crazy. This is a recent one that was prepared by some consultants to estimate the economic impact of spring training games in Pinellas County, Florida. Right? And it says spring training, what, lasts 6 weeks, maybe? right? So, you know, they always have these really glossy pictures, and they also feature these really big, round, certain-looking numbers. $2.4 billion, right? Wow, big number. And look how precise that looks. Or, you know, $9.4 million, or 24,862 hotel room nights. Now, these are all forecasts. That's not how we deal with forecasts, right? Forecasts, we all deal with forecasts. What's the weather going to be tomorrow? The weatherman doesn't say, we're getting 1.5 inches of rain tomorrow. The weatherman says, there's a 30% chance that we get some rain tomorrow. It comes with some idea of the certainty or uncertainty associated with it. These impact studies never have that. They're always big round numbers and very, right, even up to $124.2 million. I said $200,000 because they're really accurate. The issue here is these forecasts are generated by a computer program called InPlan. But in general, we call these things regional input-output models. And I just had to highlight this because this is the InPlan program is widely accepted by researchers. That's a bald-faced lie. I don't know any serious researcher, and I know a lot of them, who work on research on the economic impact of professional sports facilities, who would accept this computer program as legitimate. But that's what they use. It's basically, so there's this idea of multipliers. The economics of it works, really. So the idea is that somebody goes into a bar outside Camden Yards, and they have dinner and some drinks, and they also put down a $50 tip for the waitress. And the waitress takes that $50, and she lives in Baltimore, and she goes out to where she lives, and she spends that $50 on a haircut. And the person who cuts her hair, that's the income for that person who lives in the community and goes out and spends that, and so on and so on and so on. And that generates this multiplier effect. That works, but the interesting thing, and again, it's always these nice big numbers, big round numbers, 92 million, right? You want to stick it out in your head. Well, researchers have known that this is the wrong way to try to estimate these benefits for a long time. This paper was published in 1995. Economic impact studies, for sports facilities and events, 11 sources of misapplication. It's basically the completely wrong approach that you would take to estimating these things. Yet it's used again and again and again. Why? Because it produces the forecasts that the people that want the subsidies like to see. Big round numbers. So I just would contrast the predictions of these economic impact studies compared to these fact-based retrospective studies that myself and a lot of other economists have done over a long period of time that we've published in peer-reviewed journals that mean that other people that work in this area have looked at it and said, well, we at least sort of know what we're doing. That's very different from these economic impact studies. Okay, so there I've knocked down a bunch of the commonly mentioned reasons we should subsidize. Why not subsidize these facilities? Well, rationale number one is one that's in Econ 101, principle of microeconomics. Government funds have opportunity costs. And, you know, when the Washington, D.C. Council gave $600 million to the Nationals, that $600 million could have been spent on many other government-provided goods and services. Education, safety, public health, and transportation infrastructure. And it's really important to recognize that we have people who make decisions here. Governments face budget constraints. There's not an unlimited amount of funds the government has to provide the unlimited wants of constituents. And there's a trade-off. That's what economists would say. I just think it's not often recognized that these trade-offs have to be made because these opportunity costs must exist everywhere. Another reason we might not subsidize is that the construction process and the games generate a lot of negative externalities. For example, there's an emerging line of research, number of papers that are causal in nature that show that professional sports teams cause increases in crime in areas around stadiums, cities with Major League Baseball teams have worse traffic than cities without Major League Baseball teams. I published that paper. There's a recent paper that shows that air pollution is worse in cities with professional sports teams, probably caused by the cars that people take when they're driving to and from games. So those costs, those negative externalities, everybody in the city bears those costs, even if they go to a game or not. Right? You never have to go to a Major League Baseball game to be stuck in traffic associated with people trying to get in and out of there. It's cost everybody. Economists call that a negative externality. Economic theory says anything that generates negative externalities, you don't subsidize, you tax. Okay, so finally, I want to return to this idea of why cities lose in these negotiations with teams. So again, if Nash bargaining with no outside options were present, we'd expect most of this to wind up here in the middle. And instead, most of the outcomes are at the extreme ends. So again, I live in West Virginia now. That's one of the most famous culinary items in West Virginia, a pepperoni roll, which is basically a bun with pepperoni rolled up inside of it, right? But if you and I are negotiating over a pepperoni roll and who's going to get one, we're going to split it. Nash bargaining predicts that the equilibrium or the most likely outcome would be 50-50. We say, all right, cut it down, right? But the deal about Nash bargaining is it predicts 50-50 outcomes except when one of the negotiators has what economists call outside options. So why do cities lose negotiations? Because as a matter of public policy here in the United States, we stack the deck against cities. And that's because we have provided sports team owners with substantial outside options that allow them to consistently come out ahead in these negotiations. And the source of this is we have, as a matter of public policy, granted professional sports leagues special antitrust status. And that antitrust status is pretty simple. Every professional sports league gets to determine how many teams are in the league and where those teams play. Okay? And that's special antitrust status because that means that if a billionaire, if one of you wins the lottery and wins $700 million, and you decide, I want to bring an NBA team to Baltimore, you can't do it because the league gets to say where the NBA teams are. You couldn't just hire a bunch of players and build yourself an arena and say, all right, here I am, you got to let me in the NBA, right? Now, in any other industry except professional sports, you could do just that. Imagine if the local restaurant industry had this power and they could control how many restaurants were in the town and where they were. Now, somebody comes in and says, I want to open up a restaurant because I think it would be profitable, and the local restaurant cartel says, nope, can't do that. We control where the restaurants are and how many restaurants there are here. That person who wanted to do that could sue those people and win on antitrust grounds because that's restrained trade. Free entry is a hallmark of the competitive markets that we think we have, but except for sports. So as an example, if you might think, well, so what, right? It's no big deal. But Los Angeles, California, the second largest city in the country, for 20 years had no NFL team. Okay? And during that 20 years, I went back and looked up, did the Google search. During that 20-year period, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 teams threatened to move to Los Angeles. Almost every year, right? Right after it was the last, until 2016, the last NFL team in LA was the Rams, right? And so, as soon as the Rams left, the Bengals and Tampa Bay threatened to move to Los Angeles. So this open Los Angeles market for 20 years is the outside option that we've handed every professional sports team on. That's how they extract these subsidies, right? 96, the Seahawks starting to move. San Francisco, a whole litany of them, some of them more than once. The Saints a couple of times, they still couldn't get their replacement for the Superdome. But that, and why is, if there was not this special antitrust status, 1 minute after the Rams left LA, another NFL team would have been in there. Because you can't tell me, it appears now that they can support 2 NFL teams in Los Angeles. You can't tell me that one wouldn't have moved in there right away. So that's a matter of public policy, and that's where a lot of these subsidies come from, threats to move, and threats to move because we allow leagues to determine how many teams are in their leagues. So my final observation is, all right, there's a current debate going on here in town now about what to do about Pimlico and Preakness. So there is no academic research that I know of that has tried to assess the economic impact of a racetrack, horse racetrack. So what we have to ask ourselves is, do the horse racetracks differ substantially from stadiums or arenas? Right? I mean, it is a professional sporting event because those horses are amazing and the jockeys are professional athletes, certainly. So if we ask ourselves, do we think that there's any substantial economic impact generated by horse race tracks that would be different from stadiums or arenas? Here's the question we need to ask ourselves. If you're really going to get tangible new economic benefit out of any sort of professional sporting event, whether it's a horse race or a baseball game, it has to come from attracting people from outside of town who would not have otherwise come to the city to come in and spend money, right? Because you've got to get away from that displacement effect that I already talked about. The displacement effect, because if that really happens, then those people wouldn't have come to Baltimore except to go to a horse race. Whatever they spend is new tangible economic benefit in the local community. I believe Pimlico's running 12 times a year. That's not a lot of races. But we might say, well, what about the Preakness? I've been to Preakness. I used to live in Mount Washington. So the Preakness is a one-off big event in that it resembles something like the Super Bowl. Well, there's a lot of evidence that the Super Bowl doesn't generate much in terms of tangible economic benefits in cities, and it's just because it's a one-off thing. It happens one day a year, and 364 other days a year. That's not going on, and you can't really sustain a lot of economic activity off of a one-off, one day a year event. That's why the Super Bowl doesn't do anything. So, I mean, I've thought about it. It's just speculation on my part, but I don't see substantial differences between a horse racetrack and a professional sports stadium from the economic perspective. Now, of course, I understand that the Preakness has a long history in Baltimore, and it is again part of Baltimore's image to host the Preakness. And again, that has value, and I don't dispute that. But when I think about what would the value of that be, it would probably be along the lines of the feel-good, sense of community, world-class city status value that professional sports generate. So that's what I have. And you can probably now tell what my position typically is about any sort of subsidies for professional sports, but I've at least tried to take an objective, evidence-based overview of what economists have thought about this.
So now I want to give both Delegate Tony Bridges and Councilmember Bill Henry a quick chance to respond, and then we'll open it up to the crowd for questions. So first, I want to welcome Delegate Bridges to the podium. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Humphreys, for talking to us about subsidies and sports stadiums. And the first thing I'll tell you is I am not an economist. So I cannot dispute everything that you just said. In fact, I agree with, especially some of the things that we talked about when we talked about Pimlico Race Course. So for me, I represent that district. I represent the 41st District of Baltimore City, which includes Pimlico Race Course. So not only do I represent that area, but I still live there and actually grew up 4 blocks from Pimlico Race Course. And so I know there is a history to Pimlico, and the fact that, you know, we have a community that's bounded by borders, which include Pimlico Race Course. It now has what's called the Park Heights Master Plan. In that master plan, you've got about 30,000 residents, 1,500 acres, and a ton of disinvestment in a community. And so what I'll say about that is a stadium, a Pimlico Race Course does not make a community, right? It's part of a community. It's part of rebuilding a community, but it is not the entire community. And so I am very hopeful about what's happening right now with Pimlico Race Course and the fact that the stadium, the owners, the city of Baltimore, and the horsemen actually got together and came up with an opportunity to revitalize Pimlico Race Course, which means that Pimlico Race Course will not just have those 11 days of racing in the future, and it is only 11 days. And so for the community, they want more than just having 11 days of racing. I remember back in the day when we, because I did grow up in the community, you know, on those racing days, especially for the Preakness, there was this sort of underground economy that happens in the community. And so while we can talk about the benefits that the entire city gains from having the race course run, having Preakness run, there was also a real benefit that the community gained. I was one of those young guys that used to come up, and as people were coming to the race course, this is when people actually could take coolers into Pimlico. I was one of those guys that said, hey, let me get a couple of dollars to take the cooler into Pimlico Race Course. And we would do that the entire day. Not only that, you know, you also have individuals that use their home to park cars. And so you can make 20, 40 more dollars just parking cars in front of your house. And so there is a true benefit that the community had from having Pimlico Race Course, from having the Preakness run, you know, during that time of year. But again, most of the community now, especially, don't want just to see 11 days of racing and nothing else happening at Pimlico Race Course. And so, not to get too far in the weeds with Pimlico Race Course, there's a deal on the table to redevelop Pimlico Race Course to the tune of about $385 million, I believe. Part of what needs to happen is a bond needs to be floated in order to do the upfront costs to rebuilding the race course. There would be the clubhouse would actually be demolished and redone. The track would actually have a different sort of design to the track. In addition to that, the racecourse owners have agreed to turn over that land to the city to offer around the racecourse parcels for redevelopment, which I think is also really key, because what the community wants is not just to have a race course and redevelop a race course. They also want to see development to happen around that race course. And although we don't know what that development looks like right now, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is making sure that the community has a voice in what that development does look like moving forward. Should it be retail? Should it be a supermarket? Should it be a library? The community has been screaming for a library for years. When I was younger, we did have a library in the community. Since then, the library's closed. But there has really been a resurgence in the community to fight for a library. I think this is an opportune time to say, hey, city, you know, if you're going to redevelop in the Park Heights community, part of what we should look at is where this library should be located. In addition, you know, we need a supermarket in the community. And so I feel like all these options are on the table. And you know, one of the things we also have to do is look at how we actually fund this. And so the idea is to look at 3 different sources of funding moving forward. One is looking at video lottery terminal dollars, which comes to the community right now. There's a big debate in the community about how those funds are being used currently. It should be used for both physical development and in many cases, human development. And so for the physical development, there's approximately 65 acres that are maybe 2 blocks away from Pimlico Race Course that needs to be redeveloped. I'm really excited because 17 acres have been offered to a developer who has ideas that he wants to meet with the community to talk about what that development should finally look like. But that's 17 acres out of a 65-acre parcel of land that's not too far from Pimlico Racecourse and needs to be redeveloped. And so for that 65 acres, I grew up on Woodland Avenue, which is part of that area. And so there still needs to be a plan. The city still needs to acquire most of that acreage so that they can really offer it up for redevelopment for the entire community. And so those are some of the things that are happening in the community. On the human service side, the human capital dollars that are go towards things like community service coordinators for our schools. We actually have 2 brand new schools that are not too far away from Pimlico Racecourse, Arlington Elementary and Pimlico Elementary, that have been completely redone. I graduated from Pimlico Elementary School. It looks totally different from the way that I remember Pimlico Elementary School. And one of the things that we use that funding for is to have community school coordinators in those schools. And so with those 2 community school coordinators in each of those schools, their role is to really provide resources for those schools outside of traditionally what schools have in them. And so they'll go out and try to find service providers who can offer, eyeglasses to individuals who don't have eyeglasses, or asthma pumps for individuals who, usually use the emergency room outside of their primary care physician to have asthma pumps readily available. They also have a Safe Streets program, and so funding from those video lottery terminals go towards public safety for the community. I can never say that it's ever going to be enough, right? We still need additional dollars to go towards things that need to happen in the Park Heights community. And the video lottery terminals are just one portion of the dollars that are coming to the community. And so there's on the table, it's an option to have, I think, $3.5 million of those dollars that can range from 8 to 12 million per year, depending on what's happening with the casino funding, or how many people actually go out to gamble per year. So there's an option on the table to take 3.5 million of those to go towards bringing down the cost of that bond funding over the life of that bond. In addition, there's RFRA dollars, racetrack F something dollars. These are essentially dollars that go towards the redevelopment of Pimlico Racetrack and Laurel Racetrack. And so 8.5 million of those dollars will also go towards the redevelopment for the Pimlico Racecourse. And finally, it's the purses, 5 million of the money that the horse races actually make on the day of horse racing. 5 million of that will go towards bringing down the debt. So that's approximately $17 million a year over the life of the bond. And so that's one way that they're talking about, or in discussions with bringing down or paying for the redevelopment of Pimlico Racecourse. One thing that I will say is there's still things that need to happen, and so that's what's on the table. But when we get back to Annapolis, we really do need to sit down, figure out what this looks like and how we can actually get this done. And so although it's on the table, and I'm really optimistic because I think that this is a good plan, and the community is really in need of the redevelopment of not just Pimlico Racecourse, but the entire community. I think this goes towards really making a dent in what's happening in the Park Heights community moving forward. And so I just wanted to give my perspective on what's happening with Pimlico Racecourse and the economics of the Park Heights community. And so I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions, and I'm sure I threw a bunch of information at you that generated more questions than you probably had before. So with that, I'll let Bill Henry, our councilman, answer all the rest of the questions, and I won't come back up here, but I do want to give him an opportunity to talk about what's going on as well.
You're far too kind. Good evening. Yeah, wow, I'm still awake. I enjoyed the presentation. In fact, it was very tempting when you said we could now come up and it's very tempting to just come here and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't understand why more cities don't listen to you, because everything that you said held together. The part that struck with me the most was government funds have opportunity costs. And when I think about $600 million of public subsidy for a sports facility in a town that already had 3 major league teams, but needed to bat the cycle, whatever the triple crown, to be a world, that was going to be the difference between Washington D.C. being a world-class city or not. I think about what $600+ million would mean in Baltimore. We spent several years, the city's delegation in Annapolis, parents, teachers, fighting in Annapolis to get $1 billion over a span of years to renovate and restore or rebuild the first 2 dozen of the schools in Baltimore City that are in desperate need of restoration. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine, actually a former classmate here, back when we were considering building M&T, or SciNet, I think it was before that. He was living down in Howard County at the time, and when we were discussing whether we should build this new stadium as part of the deal to bring a team here, he said, "Weren't you complaining that you don't have enough money to keep all of your libraries open?" Because I wasn't on the city council at the time. I was just somebody that tried to advocate for Baltimore City. And he said, "Why are you spending $200 million on a stadium when you're closing libraries?" And what I told him then, and I think remains true now, is because that's what the state will give us money for. The state wouldn't give us $200 million to build new rec centers or to build new libraries, because most of the people making the decision on where the state's funds are going to go, most of them have no interest in driving into Baltimore City to use a library or a rec center. They probably didn't really enjoy the prospect of driving into Edinburgh Gardens to have to go to Memorial Stadium to watch games. But they could buy into the idea of just getting on 95 or 695 and coming a little bit into the city so that they could watch a game in nicer surroundings, in seats expensive enough that there wouldn't be really a whole lot of actual Baltimoreans there. And then once the game was over and they spent more money on food and drink at the game than the average Baltimore household spends on food in a given day, they would just get in their cars and drive back out to the county. And so they were willing to help, if that's the help that we would be willing to accept. And that, for me, is the hardest part of this decision making, because my understanding right now, this is where I have to be very careful, because as the delegate knows, he represents the district where Pimlico is. I do not represent a district where Pimlico is, and there is a measure of courtesy that elected officials are expected to extend to each other when something affects a geographic area. There's also just the basic reality of the fact that I don't know the on-the-ground situation in Park Heights like Delegate Bridges does. So it's hard for me to argue confidently whether something is a good thing or a bad thing for Park Heights, if that's not my neighborhood. What I can say is, as I understand the deal right now, of the $380-some million that would be spent, about $200 million of it would be spent on Pimlico, and the rest would be spent revitalizing the track at Laurel. So we're now back to talking about $200 million worth of investment in Baltimore. But then I go back to the opportunity cost. And the question is, if the way that the state is going to pay for this, and again, this is what I'm trying to pull out of the newspaper. Apparently, right now, there's money coming from casinos into a fund that's supposed to stop in just a few years. It would be key to making this deal work that the General Assembly find the political will to require the casinos to continue to pay that extra money into that fund for the additional 20-some years that would be needed to pay off the bonds to do this lump sum investment. At which point now I'm asking myself, what would we need to do to muster the political will to get the casinos to continue to put money into that fund if that fund was going to go to something else, something that would have a broader impact than just on the neighborhood around Pimlico. And this is a tough one. This is a tough one because I know if I was in the delegate's position, I'd be thinking, well, this is where I represent. So, of course, I'm going to fight hard to bring the resources that I can to the people that send me to Pinellas. And that's his job. But if you don't represent that district, it becomes a little bit more challenging of an internal decision of, it's almost like gambling. Do you bet that we're not going to get, I'm going away from my part, we're not going to get the political will from the General Assembly to prolong the casino funding for anything other than this. So we might as well take this and at least get a better Park Heights and Pimlico area out of the casinos. Or we can roll the dice and we can say there are other things that Baltimore needs across the broader, the spectrum of Baltimore that we could convince the General Assembly to pull the money out of the casinos and fund those other things. For example, the Kerwin Commission will be finalizing its decisions on how we should be funding education in Maryland. And I can tell you from the city side, we are already preparing for the idea that we're going to be spending more local dollars on education in order to match increased spending from the state so that all of our kids can get more resources. To the point where the Budget Bureau in the city is now referring to $100 million as a Kerwin. Like, that's how they now have conversations. They're like, the fire department, you may be interested in knowing the Baltimore City Fire Department costs about 2.5 Kerwins a year.
Yeah.
That's how they talk now in the Budget Bureau, preparing for the idea that Baltimore City will probably need to come up with at least $100 million in new funding in order to match the additional state funding we hope to get. Now, my question would be, I know that there is huge public sentiment out there for the state to spend more money on education. And I think that's a good thing. I wonder if we tried a little bit of a judo throw here, if we could get the General Assembly to take that political will to invest more in the horse racing industry and instead try to get the casinos to pay more indefinitely into a fund for education. Because some of you look like you might remember when the Maryland lottery began. And the Maryland lottery was marketed as all the money would go to education. An argument that was made again when slot machines were legalized, and again when table games were added. What was never said overtly was all the money is going to go to education, but we're going to stop sending the general funds from elsewhere into education and free ourselves up to spend money on other things. So the total increase in education spending hasn't matched the total increase in casino revenues or gambling revenues or lottery revenues, however you want to think of it. And so my question would be, the Preakness is a great and historic event, and as you say, there are you didn't say it this way, but I'll say it this way. There are intangibles out the wazoo involved in keeping the Preakness in Baltimore. But Baltimore's having a tough time. And at some point, we need to have, frankly, a broader public conversation about what intangibles are we willing to pay for, and which intangibles should we accept might be less important than tangibles. That's it. Thank you. And I'll leave all the questions for the actual professor.
So we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. I think it's small enough of a room that you can all just stand up. Yep.
Hi, in the graph that had the cities that had up to 100% publicly financed, were there any kind of statistics or similarities among the places that gave out it had 100% being from public money?
This one.
Yes, that one.
That's a great question.
Or if you were to predict them, what do you think they would be?
Yeah, I have not. That's actually an excellent question. It's not something. There's certainly no research on it. I wonder if. I doubt it. It's not. I don't think it's franchise success. I wonder if it has something to do with how long those teams have been playing in those cities or not. And I wonder if it has something to do with the political position that the mayor or governor would be in at the time when this subsidy is being determined. Because certainly an elected official who maybe is uncertain about her ability to continue to be reelected might really be in favor of handing out those subsidies. I don't know. Those are two factors off the top of my head that I think might play a role. I think maybe the specific sports might it might be the football teams tend to get. That would be something that would be ezy to look at. And actually, that's not a bad idea.
Okay.
And a research project.
And one more question: can you look into examples of taxpayer, for instance, when the Browns moved from Cleveland to Baltimore, the mayor was pushing for a tax referendum to increase the sin tax. For other examples of that, where it's on the voters themselves to pick whether they can afford the team or not, what happens?
Absolutely. I've written a paper on that, in fact. Not on a team move, but I wrote a paper that looked at how the financing for the renovation of Lambeau Field worked. And the residents of the county where Lambeau Field is had a referendum, and they voted overwhelmingly to tax themselves an amount which would work out to about $1,500 per household in increase in sales taxes in order to renovate Lambeau Field when they did the last big reno on Lambeau Field. So, I mean, it was clearly tied to a tax, and my paper showed that the closer people lived to Lambeau Field, the more likely they were to vote in favor of that tax increase. So it happens, and it does.
Hey, I'm Yair. I'm from computer science, so I'm nobody. I've been here 24 years. So I have a quick question. Can you say something about the 10% that actually financed all of it? how come the city never gave in there? Is that because the city is saying, hey, you'll be lucky to be in our market, or so be my guest, if you want to do it, do it.
So certainly in one case, I mentioned that the San Francisco Giants had paid for 100% of their baseball stadium. Well, they had 2 referenda in San Francisco about that, and both of them were voted down.
Voted down to what, to help them?
Yes, there was a referendum on the subsidy.
So wonderful. So this is what I'm after, and I thought maybe is more to the representatives, because I don't understand horse racing that well. I have a company that actually that I founded that runs those races as villains in live events, and I know the timeliness is so important because of the betting. But I understand NBA quite a bit because I'm a big fan for many years. And I know that in the NBA today, the players, the 450 players that are NBA players are making more than 50% of all of the revenues that goes into professional basketball. So this, and I love those players, but what it means is a transfer from, to those players, right? So when you
And owners.
put and owners, but the players are taking more than 50%. So to few people, it's the owners, maybe you have 30 owners and 450 players, and the cities take millions. Calculate how many. So I think, how would you fight that? I don't know, but I would say maybe the representatives should just say, not in our area, not in our state, not in our state. You want to come here to Maryland, the highest median family income state in the whole country, maybe the most educated, be our guest. I don't know what happens in sports teams like that exactly, but look what happened when the 200 places bid on getting Amazons to their place in the high tech. I understand high tech. I'm from computer science. What happened in the end? Amazon did not go to any place that gave it really good subsidies. They did not. They went to the one place that everybody knew from the get-go they would go there. Okay? Behind the river, crossing the river into North Virginia.
I think
why? Because it made sense to them to do it. So the fact that Maryland offered them, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 times more, didn't matter. So it's lucky for us to some degree. It's not lucky for us in another degree. Maybe the representatives all over would see. So the question is, do you believe in that? Do you believe that this is correct?
If I could say one specific thing just for everyone to understand about how those subsidies or incentives are decided upon, it is not common that there is a big public process involved. Most of the time, the package for the offer to Amazon was developed literally in secret by the mayor's staff working with some business advisors, and the entire Baltimore City Council read about it in the paper after it became public. There were no hearings, there were no opportunities to engage the citizens and ask for feedback.
So you don't need to vote for that?
I suspect that if we had won, if Amazon had picked us, the best example would be most recently the Port Covington tax increment financing. The deal was worked out between the mayor and the mayor's people and Sagamore, and then once they come up with a deal, then they brought that deal to the city council to be voted on. And then the city council had public hearings and lots of opportunity for input, and then the council had to make a public vote. but coming up with the deal is not a public process. And so that's just something to factor in, that yes, that in retrospect, it looks like the offer we made was unreasonably foolish, which means we may not have actually gone through with it once the people had to be part of agreeing to it.
I also think that's part of what happened with Pimlico Racecourse as well. So, the deal was done with the mayor, the Stronachs who own Pimlico Racecourse, and the Horsemen. And so they came up with the deal. And now the deal is on the table, and it's up to the Maryland General Assembly to actually vote to approve, how we move forward with funding the deal. And so there is a public process with hearings and individuals, giving their input. Right, it's not a done deal.
Yeah, two quick things. One, maybe you mentioned this, but I didn't hear it. Is the Stronachs group putting up any money in this process? And if they are, how much are they saying they're putting up? What percentage of the total package are they paying for? And secondly, what's the viability of horse racing? It seems like it's a dying industry. There's so many other ways now that people can engage in sport. There's so many other ways that people can gamble. You have more days at Pimlico. How many people are going to go? How many people, wear horse racing shirts and have the colors of whatever. It's just,
Right.
It's a dying industry.
That's a really good question, right? And so part of the angst in the community is, why do we only have 11 days of racing? That includes
But even if you have more days, right?
And so what the
Who's gonna go?
community is asking for is not to have more days of racing. The community is asking for more activity. We don't want to have just a vacant plot of land in the community, for 300 something plus days out of the year. We want some economic activity. We want something to be there. Maybe it's concerts, maybe it's something, but the community needs to work with the city to figure out what other activities actually need to go there outside of racing. So, Pimlico, the Preakness is part of the Triple Crown. Yes, of course, we want that to be there, but, in addition to just having the Triple Crown of racing there, what other amenities, what other things can we put there so that it's not just we're relying on economic benefits of the Preakness to, move things that's happening in the community. The
How
other
about
question
the group, the owners, how much are they putting up?
Right, and so I don't know all the details, because again, I wasn't part of the negotiations. So this is what I've gleaned from the information that was given to me, but I do know that the owners are giving up the land to the city of Baltimore so that the city can actually do the redevelopment process and come up with what should happen. So they are giving up something, but I don't.
They're also paying the annual, I think it was $8 to $10 million that's going to be spent on putting up and taking down temporary suites and stands to expand the ability to watch the Preakness for the Preakness. The way that the concept plans are designed is most of the year, Pimlico would be a large open space with room for athletic fields, farmers markets, any concerts, any other activities that the city and the community want to hold there. But when there's the month of racing and the month leading up to it, they would literally construct nice quality but temporary luxury boxes essentially along the edge of the infield and expand the seating in the grandstand area so that when the 12 days of racing happen and the Preakness happen, there is room for the extra people who are there for that. But then that all goes away when racing season is over, and what remains is a far more modest grandstand, which isn't ridiculous to try to heat in the winter and cool in the summer. I think there's going to be a permanent restaurant, a permanent venue, like a facility. Bill Cole specifically spoke to the fact that Baltimore City high school students at this point tend to have to hold their junior and senior proms at facilities outside the city because there is no venue big enough to hold a high school prom that isn't essentially a really nice fancy hotel that's going to charge more than the kids can afford to pay. So they're going to places out around $695, and it would be nice for the city to have the access to a venue that was under its control, modern, and capable of, that flexibility seems to be a lot of the appeal of this, is that rather than just restoring Pimlico as it is right now, the plan is to reorient, redesign, and reconstruct Pimlico in a way that it can both be 12 days of racing a year culminating in the Preakness and still be a community amenity for the other larger chunk of the year.
How does that drive revenue through the community? I've been to many Preaknesses as recent as this year, and I've never spent $1 in the neighborhood outside that day. A little bit in the underground economy for parking, I'll give you that. I mean, you can use your carrier service one time for a cooler. But outside of that, it's the classic baseball example where I go to the game and I leave. I go to the suburbs. I'm not spending any money. So again, this is another subsidized stadium at the end of the day. Your community, your district may be better served by the expansion of Sinai and Lightbridge, creating real jobs, not just one-day parking jobs.
So one thing that I did fail to mention is the fact that Sinai is building on that site as well. And so they are, there's a site that they actually own that's adjacent where Pimlico Road goes through that they use for parking for right now, but they have a design on the table and actually development dollars, close to I think $260 million that they're using to actually redevelop their site. They're gonna have inpatient services and some other things that are actually gonna be built on that site as well. The other thing about this is again, that 65 acres that I talked about is maybe 2 blocks down the road. And so we're still meeting with the community to talk about what other amenities should go into the community outside of just housing, and having a housing market. And so right next to it is C.C. Jackson Recreation Center, and there's a big wide open space. And so do we just put housing there? Like, we do want people to stay and do things in our community, and so why not put some other retail, restaurants, something else to keep people in the community? And so all of that is still on the table.
You had a question?
Got one
I
last
did.
question.
I wanted you in the beginning when I came in said that you do think there are reasons, good reasons, why a stadium should be subsidized, and I want to know what you think they are.
So professional sports has the aspects of a public good. The public good is an economic good that is not excludable, right? If you're familiar with what a public, okay. So sports has a clear public good aspect, and public goods are undersupplied in market economies, and so to the extent that sports represents a public good, it should get some subsidization, or there wouldn't be the stadiums that we have. That's one. Two is, it's also clear that professional sports generates substantial consumer surplus. I mean, people that follow the Ravens or follow the Orioles, they're getting way more value and willingness to pay out of that than they actually pay to listen to them on the radio or whatever. And, teams would like to be able to extract that consumer surplus, but they can't. And the presence of that substantial consumer surplus is another justification for subsidization. And then I do think that maybe the estimates of intangibles are not quite as big as they might be. And I think you could take a bunch of these things and add them up and approach not as big as the subsidies that we provide, but zero is not the right amount of subsidy, I think. But again, I don't know where between.
But one probably is not.
One is not right. That's right. That's definitely wrong. So those are some of the things, but you never You never hear a team owner go out and say, we're actually providing in a sense of public good in this community because you get to follow this team and never pay me a dollar. That's not the argument that gets made. It's going to create 15,000 jobs.
Thank you. That's all we have time for, but feel free to hang around and ask questions later.
Let me tell you,